All right, thanks for being here with me. This is video 6 of chapter 8 of Liberate, the investing chapter, and we're going over the hidden cost of reducing volatility, inflation risk. Now, if you want to lower your investment income engine's risk and return by adding bonds, I suggest not being more conservative than adding by the age rule of thumb. This rule of thumb says to match the percentage of bonds in your investment income engine to your age. If you are 20 years old, you should have 20% allocated to bonds, but probably less. If you're 40, you should have 40% allocated to bonds, but probably less. If you are 60, you should have 60% allocated to bonds, but probably less. Right? This is if you do still want to reduce your risk with bonds, this is a rule of thumb that you could use. But as I said, probably less. Once again, the main problem with being too conservative when dealing with average market returns is that you still have to combat inflation. And we learned about how bad inflation is. Remember, you don't only want to match inflation, you want to outpace inflation by a decent margin, right? We're always talking about these buffers. We want to have this margin, this buffer to protect us. You can see in the following chart that there is an inverse relationship between the percentage of bonds in a portfolio based on age and the portfolio's weighted average return. While some may not be comfortable with higher risk, you must be careful that your returns are not too low because of inflation. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. What we're looking at over on this side, percentage of bonds in your portfolio, right? 0% allocated to bonds versus 100%. Over here, we're looking at the return on the portfolio from 0% average return to 10% average return. And then we have down here, we have the actual percentage allocated to the bond fund. So this color right here is the percent of bonds in the portfolio. This is the portfolio return, and then the average inflation rate. So this dotted line right here is the average inflation rate, which we want to be above that, right? We definitely don't want to be below it, and we want to definitely have our return be have a margin of safety, right, above that inflation rate. Okay, so just looking over here, we've allocated 20% to bonds and the rest to stocks. And when we do that, assuming the returns, right, 4% on bonds and 8% on stocks, we're getting an average return of 7.2% on our stock portfolio. When we go ahead and change that allocation, and now we have 40% allocated to bonds and 60% to stocks, right, the return on the portfolio is going to drop to 6.4%. Now, in this case, we have 60% allocated to bonds and 40% allocated to stocks, and our average return drops to 5.6%. And then in this scenario, we have 80% allocated to bonds, 20% to stocks, and our return drops to 4.8%. Right? We see as we add as we add more bonds to the portfolio, our average return is decreasing. Okay. So I mentioned earlier how inflation steals your purchasing power yearly and that you must fight back. You can't keep Mr. Inflation from stealing. You can only deploy your dollar soldiers to work in the stock market instead of the bond market. As an oversimplified example, if you invest in bonds at a long-term return of 4%, and inflation is stealing 3%, that leaves you with a real return of about 1%. It is extraordinarily difficult to grow money at 1%. Compare that to investing in stocks. If you expect an 8% average long-term return and inflation takes away 3%, you are left with a real return of around 5%. While not great, it is still 5 times higher than 1%. Inflation should be one of the motivators that nudge you to hold a higher percentage of stocks in your investment income engine. Let's compare the cumulative or annual combined return between 1% and 5% over varying periods. For example, the cumulative return over 10 years at 1% is 10.46% versus 62.89% at 5%. Next, if you compare the cumulative returns over 20 years, you get 22% at 1% versus 165% at 5%. Finally, after 30 years, the cumulative difference is substantial between the two, at 34.7% and 332%, respectively. Therefore, when choosing an index fund, whether it is a bond fund or a stock fund, it must have the capability to meet your required FI return. Anything less won't get you where you want to be on time. You have to put yourself in a situation where you can win FI. So right here, if I just scroll down, this is basically just describing what we talked about, but this right here, this kind of gray area over 10 years at 1%, your cumulative return versus at 5%, and then over 20 years, your cumulative return, and at 5%, your cumulative return over 20 years, and then the 30 years. The cumulative return is 3.4 versus 332%, assuming we're talking about these are real returns after inflation. Just to give you an example of the large gap between those two. As an additional analogy, if the size of the investment income engine represents the value of your account, the asset classes are like the fuel that powers the engine. A larger engine has the potential to create more power and more income. However, not all fuels are the same. There are formulas designed for maximum output on one end of the spectrum. On the other side, there is unleaded gasoline. It'll get you where you are going, but it is not as powerful as some other fuels. The various fuel types are representative of the asset classes. You can use regular gasoline, like bonds, or you can use jet fuel, like stocks. The specially designed optimal jet fuel produces the power needed to drive the engine faster. Different fuels have different levels of efficiency and risk, and stocks and bonds offer different risk and return profiles. For example, assume that bonds represent regular gasoline, which provides a 4% return, and stocks represent jet fuel with an 8% return. A $1 million investment income engine, right? That's the amount you've accumulated for, say, retirement or to achieve your financial independence. Using gasoline will generate $40,000 annually, 4% on $1 million, compared to jet fuel, which produces $80,000 annually, 8% on $1 million. Okay, we're going to go ahead and stop the video here and then pick up with what is your FI number. Go through some math and calculate that. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next video.